I never imagined that the sound of my own begging would haunt me more than the violence itself. But there I was, 3 months after my husband's funeral, whispering, "Please stop," into my pillow, while the man who had raised him destroyed what was left of my world. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, it was how my 26-year-old mind kept insisting this couldn't be real, that Baba couldn't be doing this to me, that families were supposed to protect each other. My name is Mira Patel, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest, and how I discovered that even when you think you've lost everything, you can still choose to fight back. It's about finding your voice when silence feels safer, about protecting your child when you can barely protect yourself, and about the terrible moment when you realize that surviving isn't enough. You have to decide to live. What happened to me could happen to anyone. In fact, it probably has happened to women, women who smile at school, pick up and make small talk at the grocery store, women who carry their shame like a stone in their chest because they don't know how to set it down. I'm telling this story for them and for the woman I used to be, the one who thought begging would save her. In 1995, I was living what I thought was a perfectly ordinary life in Nashik, a mid-sized city in Maharashtra, where the pace was slower than Mumbai but faster than village life. I had married Arjun Patel 2 years earlier when I was 24 and he was 29. Unlike many couples in our community, we had chosen each other meeting at the software company where he worked as a programmer, and I managed the small library that served the employees' families. Arjun was quiet in the way that made people lean in to hear him better. He spoke carefully, choosing his words like he was solving a puzzle, which I suppose made sense given his profession. He had gentle hands that he used to fix broken electronics for our neighbors, and he could make me laugh with his perfectly timed observations about the absurdities of office life. "Mrs. Sharma brought her cat to work again today," he would say over dinner, completely serious. "I think she believes it's helping her type faster." Our courtship had been sweet and uncomplicated. He would walk me home from work carrying my bag without being asked, listening to my stories about the children who came to the library after school. He never interrupted, never tried to solve my problems unless I asked for help, never made me feel like my thoughts were less important than his. When he proposed, it was with a speech he had clearly prepared. "Mira, I know I'm not the most exciting person in the world, but I promise you'll never have to wonder if I love you. I'll make sure you know every single day." He kept that promise. Every morning before work, he would make tea and bring it to me in bed, along with whatever small thing had made him think of me: a flower from our neighbor's garden, a newspaper clipping about a new library opening, somewhere once a rock he found that was shaped like a heart. "Good morning, my favorite librarian," he would say, even on Saturdays when I wasn't working. We lived in a small apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with thin walls and unreliable electricity, but it felt like a palace because it was ours. I had painted the kitchen yellow, a color Arjun initially questioned, but grew to love, and filled the windowsills with small clay pots where I grew mint and coriander. The apartment smelled like spices and books, and in the evenings we would sit on our tiny balcony, watching the city lights come on, while Arjun told me about the programs he was writing, and I told him about the books I was ordering for the library. Arjun's father, whom I called Papaji out of respect, lived alone in a larger house about 20 minutes away by rickshaw. His name was Krishnan Patel, and at 64, he was still a commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with thick gray hair, and a voice that carried authority from his years as a government administrator. He had raised Arjun as a single father after his wife died in a car accident when Arjun was 12, and the bond between them was strong and uncomplicated. At least it seemed uncomplicated to me. Papaji welcomed me into the family with what appeared to be genuine warmth. He insisted I call him Papaji rather than the more formal uncle, saying I was his daughter now, not just his daughter-in-law. He brought gifts when he visited saris for festivals, books he thought I would enjoy, sweets from the shop near his office. He was generous with his time too, helping us move furniture when we rearranged the apartment, teaching me to drive his old Maruti so I wouldn't have to depend on rickshaws, sharing stories about Arjun's childhood that made us all laugh. But even then, there were moments that made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't name. The way his hands would linger on my shoulders when he helped me with my coat. How his eyes would follow me when I moved around the room, not in the absent way people look at family members, but with a focused intensity that made my skin feel warm. Once, when I was reaching for something on a high shelf, he came up behind me to help, pressing closer than necessary, his breath warm against my neck, as he said, "You should ask for help with things like this, beta. I don't want you to get hurt." I told myself these were normal interactions, that I was being overly sensitive, because I wasn't used to having a father figure in my life. My own father had died when I was 15, and I had been raised by my mother and grandmother, a household of women who were careful about physical boundaries with men outside our immediate family. Papaji's casual affection felt strange because it was unfamiliar, not because it was inappropriate. Arjun never seemed to notice these moments, but then again, Papaji was always more careful when his son was present. The lingering touches, the too long looks, the comments that made me vaguely uncomfortable, these happened when Arjun was in another room or distracted by work. Looking back now, I can see that Papaji was testing boundaries from the very beginning, seeing how much he could get away with, how I would respond to increasingly familiar behavior. He was a smart man who understood that grooming doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process of normalizing inappropriate contact, making the victim question their own discomfort, establishing a pattern of secrecy and shame. But I didn't understand any of that then. I just knew that sometimes Papaji made me feel uneasy, and I assumed the problem was my own inexperience with family relationships. In early 1997, I discovered I was pregnant. Arjun was so excited, he called Papaji immediately, despite it being nearly midnight, shouting the news into the phone like a child who couldn't wait until morning to share good news. Papaji came over the next day with marigold flowers and a bottle of expensive mithai, hugging me tighter and longer than usual while saying, "Now you've made our family complete, beta. Now you belong to us forever." At the time, I thought he was just expressing joy about becoming a grandfather. I didn't understand that he was already planning how to use my pregnancy to control me. Our daughter Asha was born in October 1997. A healthy baby with Arjun's thoughtful eyes and my stubborn chin. Arjun was a devoted father from the moment she arrived, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floors with her, when she cried, singing off-key lullabies that somehow always put her to sleep. Papaji was equally smitten, bringing baby clothes and toys, insisting on taking hundreds of photographs, calling her "my little princess," and promising to spoil her terribly. For the first 8 months of Asha's life, our world felt perfect in its ordinariness. Arjun had been promoted at work, which meant better pay and more responsibility. I had taken maternity leave, but was planning to return to the library part-time when Asha was a year old. We had started looking at larger apartments, dreaming about maybe buying our own place someday, talking about having another child in a few years. Then, on a Tuesday evening in June 1998, Arjun went to the market to buy vegetables for dinner and never came home. The rickshaw driver said later that it happened very fast, a delivery truck running a red light, the collision that sent Arjun's scooter spinning into oncoming traffic. He was unconscious when the ambulance arrived and died on the way to the hospital without ever waking up. I was 27 years old with a 9-month-old baby and a life that had been completely upended in a single moment. The funeral rituals lasted for 13 days, according to Hindu tradition, and I moved through them like someone in a dream. I remember fragments, the smell of sandalwood incense mixed with marigold flowers. The sound of prayers I couldn't focus on enough to understand the weight of Asha in my arms as she fussed through ceremonies that went on for hours. People kept touching me, patting my shoulder, holding my hands, embracing me, while they whispered condolences, and I felt like I was watching it all happen to someone else. Papa G handled everything. He organized the cremation, arranged for the priests, coordinated with Arjun's office about final salary, and benefits, managed the flow of relatives and neighbors who came to pay their respects. I was grateful for his competence because I could barely remember to eat or change Asha's diapers, let alone deal with funeral logistics. "Don't worry about anything," he told me repeatedly during those 13 days. "I'll take care of everything. You just focus on the baby and on grieving properly." The grieving properly part involved a lot of rules. I had never heard of specific prayers to say at specific times, particular foods to eat, or avoid restrictions on where I could go and what I could do. Papa Ji explained each requirement, patiently emphasizing how important it was to honor Arjun's spirit by following tradition exactly. I didn't question any of it because I didn't know enough about Hindu funeral customs to distinguish between actual religious requirements and Papa Ji's personal preferences. After the official mourning period ended, reality started settling in. Arjun's salary had stopped, obviously, and while the company had provided some compensation for his accidental death, it wasn't enough to support Asha and me long-term. The apartment we had shared was affordable on 2 incomes, but would stretch my resources dangerously on just my part-time library salary. I would need to find full-time work, which meant arranging childcare for Aisha, which meant spending money I didn't have on services I had previously provided myself. Papa Ji had been thinking about these practical concerns too, and he had a solution. "Come stay with me," he said on the morning after the mourning period officially ended. We were sitting in my kitchen drinking tea while Asha played with wooden blocks on the floor between us. "It makes sense for everyone. You won't have to pay rent, I'll help with childcare so you can work, and Asha will grow up knowing her grandfather properly." It did make sense, practically speaking. Papa G's house was large and comfortable with a garden where Asha could play safely and enough space that we wouldn't be living on top of each other. He was retired from his government job but received a good pension so money wouldn't be as tight as it would be if I tried to manage alone. Most importantly, he genuinely seemed to love Asha and want to be involved in raising her. "Yeah, are you sure?" I asked. "Having a baby in the house is very different from visiting for an afternoon. She wakes up crying, she's messy, she needs constant attention." Papa G smiled and reached down to pick up Asha, who immediately grabbed his glasses and tried to put them in her mouth. "This little princess could never be too much trouble," he said gently, retrieving his glasses while she giggled. "Besides, it will be good for me to have family in the house again. I've been lonely since Arjun grew up and moved out." I felt a flutter of unease at his words, though I couldn't have explained why. Something about the way he said "family in the house" felt loaded with meaning I didn't understand. But Asha was clearly comfortable with him, and I was too overwhelmed by grief and practical concerns to analyze my vague discomfort.
"All right," I said. "We'll try it for a few months and see how it works."
Papa G's smile widened, and he bounced Asha gently on his knee. "You've made an old man very happy, Beta. We're going to take such good care of each other." The move happened quickly. Papa G insisted on hiring men to pack and transport our belongings, waving away my protests about the expense. "You have enough to worry about," he said. "Let me handle the practical things." He gave us the master bedroom, saying an old man didn't need so much space, and Asha should have room to crawl around safely. He helped me arrange the furniture exactly the way I wanted it, hung pictures on the walls without being asked, and even bought a new crib for Asha because her old one had been damaged during the move. For the first few weeks, the arrangement worked better than I had dared to hope. Papa G was helpful without being intrusive, giving me space to grieve, while making sure Asha was fed and entertained when I couldn't manage it. He cooked elaborate meals trying to tempt my appetite back, and he never complained when I was too tired or sad to be good company. When I cried, which I did often, usually when I was alone in the bedroom, Arjun and I should have been sharing. Papa G pretended not to notice, giving me privacy to fall apart without making me feel guilty about it. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It started with small boundary crossings that I initially dismissed. Papa G would come into the bedroom without knocking, apologizing if he caught me changing clothes, but not seeming particularly embarrassed about it. He began commenting on my appearance more frequently, telling me I was getting too thin, that I should wear brighter colors because black made me look sick, that Arjun would want me to take better care of myself. "You're still a young woman," he said one morning when I came to breakfast in the same old salwar kameez I had been wearing for 3 days. "You can't stop living just because Arjun is gone." His tone was caring, paternal, but something about the way his eyes moved over my body when he said, "young woman," made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being paranoid, that grief was making me hypersensitive to normal interactions. The night it happened, I had finally fallen into deep sleep for the first time in weeks. Asha had been sleeping through the night more consistently, and physical exhaustion had temporarily overwhelmed my emotional turmoil. I was dreaming about Arjun, one of those vivid dreams where he felt completely present and real, where I could smell his aftershave and hear his voice clearly. I woke up because someone was touching my face. For a moment, still caught between sleep and wakefulness, I thought it might be Arjun. But as consciousness returned, I realized the hand stroking my cheek was too rough, too large, too unfamiliar. I opened my eyes and saw Papaji sitting on the edge of my bed, still fully dressed, looking down at me with an expression I had never seen before. "Papaji," I whispered, confused and suddenly very awake. "What's wrong? Is Asha okay?" "Asha is fine," he said softly. His hand moved from my cheek to my hair, fingers tangling in the strands in a way that was definitely not paternal. "She's sleeping peacefully." I started to sit up, but his other hand pressed against my shoulder, holding me down. Not violently, but with enough pressure to make it clear that he wanted me to stay where I was. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice still thick with sleep and confusion. "Taking care of you," he said, his voice different now, lower, rougher, with an undertone that made my stomach clench with fear. "You've been so sad, Beta. So alone. You need comfort." His hand was moving down from my hair to my neck, his thumb brushing against my collarbone in a way that was unmistakably sexual. I tried to move away, but I was trapped between his body and the wall, with Asha sleeping in her crib just a few feet away. "Please don't," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I was terrified of waking Asha, terrified of what might happen if she saw this, terrified of making noise that might escalate the situation. "Shh," Papaji said, his face moving closer to mine. I could smell tobacco on his breath and something else, something sour and wrong that made my stomach turn. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm going to take care of you the way Arjun would have wanted." The mention of Arjun's name in this context was so shocking, so fundamentally wrong, that it broke through my paralysis. I pushed against his chest with both hands, trying to create space between us. "No," I said more firmly. "Please stop. This isn't right." But Papaji was stronger than me, and he had positioned himself strategically. When I tried to push him away, he caught my wrists and pinned them against the pillow above my head. His weight was pressing me into the mattress, making it hard to breathe, making it impossible to move effectively. "You owe me," he said, his voice harsh now, all pretense of gentleness gone. "I took you in when you had nowhere else to go. I'm feeding you, housing, you taking care of your child. This is how you repay that kindness." What happened next is burned into my memory with terrible clarity. The sound of fabric tearing as he ripped my nightgown. The feeling of his hands on my body, rough and demanding and completely without consent. The way my mind seemed to detach from the physical reality floating somewhere above the bed, while I watched this violation happen to someone who looked like me, but couldn't possibly be me. I bit my tongue to keep from crying out, tasting blood, as I tried to stay silent for Asha's sake. I focused on her steady breathing from the crib, using the sound as an anchor to keep myself from disappearing completely into the horror of what was happening. When it was over, Papa G stood up and straightened his clothes, as if nothing unusual had occurred. He looked down at me, naked bleeding, shaking with shock and trauma, and his expression was satisfied, almost pleased.
"This is how it's going to be from now on," he said calmly. "You belong to this family, and families take care of each other. You'll learn to accept it, maybe even enjoy it. Most women do eventually."
Then he left the room, closing the door behind him with careful quiet, leaving me alone with my torn nightgown and the terrible knowledge that my safe haven had become a trap. The next morning, Papa G was making breakfast when I stumbled into the kitchen, having changed into fresh clothes and washed the blood from my mouth. He looked up from the stove with the same grandfatherly smile he had worn 1,000 times before, as if nothing had changed between us.
"Good morning, Beta," he said cheerfully, holding up a plate of parathas. "I made your favorite aloo parathas with extra ghee. You need to keep your strength up."
I stared at him, wondering if I had experienced some kind of psychotic break during the night. This man serving me breakfast, asking if I wanted extra yogurt with my meal, could not possibly be the same person who had violated me in the darkness. The cognitive disconnect was so complete that for a moment I genuinely questioned my own memory. But when he handed me the plate, his fingers deliberately brushed against mine, and I saw something predatory flicker in his eyes there and gone so quickly that anyone else would have missed it. It hadn't been a nightmare or a breakdown. It had really happened.
"I'm not hungry,"
I managed to say, my voice coming out as barely a whisper.
"Nonsense,"
Papa G said, his tone still warmly paternal. "You're getting too thin. How will you have energy to take care of Asha if you don't eat properly?" Asha was in her high chair, happily smearing mashed banana across her face, completely oblivious to the tension crackling between the adults in the room. She looked at me and smiled, reaching out with sticky fingers, and I realized that she had no idea anything was wrong. To her, this was just another normal morning in our new home.
I forced myself to eat a few bites of the paratha, my stomach churning with each mouthful. Papa G watched me eat with the same satisfied expression he had worn the night before, as if my compliance, even this small forced compliance, proved something important to him. After breakfast, he left for his morning walk, a routine he had maintained for years. As soon as I heard the front door close, I ran to the phone and dialed my mother's number in Pune. But when she answered, cheerful and unsuspecting, I found myself unable to speak. "Hello, Mira, is that you? Are you all right?" How could I explain what had happened? How could I tell my 60-year-old mother that the man she had trusted to take care of her widowed daughter had raped me in the bed I shared with his dead son? How could I burden her with this knowledge when she was already worried about my grief and struggling with her own health problems? "I'm fine, Mama," I lied. "I just wanted to hear your voice." "You sound strange, Beta. Are you sure you're all right? Is Papa G taking good care of you and Asha?"
The irony of her question nearly broke me. "Yes," I whispered. "He's taking very good care of us." After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table, trying to think rationally about my situation. I could pack our things and find somewhere else to live, but where would I go? My mother's small apartment in Pune was barely big enough for one person, and she was living on a modest pension that wouldn't stretch to support 3 people. I had friends from work, but none close enough to impose on with a baby, and no clear plan for the future. More importantly, what would I tell people? That Papa G had sexually assaulted me? Who would believe such an accusation against a respected retired government official who was known for his devotion to his dead son's family? In our conservative society, widows who made such claims were often viewed with suspicion, assumed to be either mentally unstable from grief or morally compromised in some way. And what if Papa G retaliated by claiming I was an unfit mother? As the male head of the family, he had significant legal and social authority. He could argue that I was having psychological problems, that I was neglecting Asha, that she would be better off in his custody while I recovered from my obvious mental breakdown. The thought of losing Asha terrified me more than anything Papa G might do to me.
So I stayed silent, and that silence became a prison more secure than any locked door.
The assault wasn't an isolated incident. Within a week, Papa G established a pattern that would continue for months. During the day, he was the perfect grandfather and father-in-law, helpful kind, concerned about my well-being. He took Asha to the park, bought groceries, cooked meals, maintained the house. He never said or did anything inappropriate when other people were around, never gave anyone reason to suspect that anything was wrong. But at night, he would come to my room. Sometimes he would wake me from sleep. Other times he would simply appear when I was getting ready for bed, making it clear that resistance was futile. He never used more physical force than necessary to subdue me, but the threat of violence was always present. More effective than physical intimidation was his control over my practical circumstances. He could throw Asha and me out at any time, could ruin my reputation with a few carefully chosen words to the right people, could make it impossible for me to find work or housing. "You should be grateful," he would whisper during those terrible encounters. "Other men would have thrown you out after Arjun died. I'm giving you a home security, a future for your daughter. This is a small price to pay for all of that." He was expert at psychological manipulation, alternating between threats and fake tenderness, making me feel like I was somehow complicit in what was happening. He would bring me gifts the day after particularly brutal assaults. Jewelry, saris, books he thought I would enjoy, as if we were lovers rather than rapist and victim. "You're starting to understand," he would say when I accepted these gifts without protest. "You're learning how good we can be for each other." The isolation was complete and deliberate. Papa G began monitoring my activities, always having a reason to accompany me when I left the house. If I went to the market, he came along to help carry things. If I took Asha to the park, he joined us because fresh air is good for old bones too. He intercepted the mail, answered the phone when I wasn't nearby, and gradually discouraged my few friends from visiting by being subtly unwelcoming when they came to the house. Within 2 months, I was more isolated than I had ever been in my life, trapped in a house with a man who was systematically destroying my sense of self while pretending to be my protector. But even as I was drowning in despair and trauma, some part of me was learning to survive. I started paying attention to Papa G's patterns, noting when he was more likely to be violent, what seemed to trigger his worst behavior, how I could minimize the harm without escalating the situation. I began hiding small amounts of money from the household budget, just a few rupees at a time, not enough for him to notice, but enough to give me a tiny sense of agency. Most importantly, I started keeping a record. Using an old notebook I found in a kitchen drawer, I began writing down what happened to me each night. I coded the entries carefully, disguising them as household accounts and grocery lists, but recording the essential facts, dates, times, what Papa G said and did, how my body was healing or not healing from previous assaults. The writing became my lifeline, the one thing Papa G couldn't take away from me completely. In those pages, I could acknowledge the truth of my experience, could document the reality that everyone else in my life was oblivious to. It was a way of preserving my sanity, of insisting that what was happening to me was real and wrong, even when Papa G's manipulation made me doubt my own perceptions. I hid the notebook inside Asha's diaper bag, reasoning that Papa G would never search through baby supplies. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt enormous to me, proof that some part of me was still fighting, still refusing to disappear completely into victimhood. By December 1998, 6 months after Papa G's assaults began, I had developed a routine of survival that felt like wearing a mask that never came off. During the day, I played the role of the grateful daughter-in-law, helping with housework, caring for Asha, making conversation about mundane topics, as if my world hadn't been turned upside down. At night, I endured Papa G's visits with the minimum resistance necessary to protect Asha from witnessing anything that would traumatize her. But something was changing inside me slowly and almost imperceptibly. It started with small moments of clarity that broke through the fog of trauma
and depression. One morning, while I was giving Asha her bath, she looked up at me with Arjun's thoughtful eyes and said, "Mama sad." Her concern for me expressed in her limited 2-year-old vocabulary pierced through my numbness like sunlight through clouds. "Mama is sad sometimes," I told her, stroking her wet hair. "But Mama loves you very, very much." "Oh, love Mama too," she said seriously, then splashed water everywhere and giggled, and for a moment I remembered what joy felt like. These moments with Asha became my anchor points, reminding me that I wasn't just surviving for myself. I was the only thing standing between my daughter and a man who was capable of terrible things. That responsibility felt overwhelming, but it also gave me purpose beyond mere endurance. I began to pay more attention to the outside world, looking for opportunities and resources I had been too depressed to notice before. When I took Asha to the pediatrician for her regular checkup, I noticed that the clinic had posters about domestic violence resources, including a phone number for a women's helpline. I memorized the number, though I didn't yet have the courage to call it. At the library, where I had worked before Arjun's death, I learned that they were looking for someone to work part-time in the children's section. The position wouldn't pay much, but it would give me a reason to leave the house regularly and interact with people who knew me from before my world collapsed. "I'd love to have you back," said Mrs. Krishnan, the head librarian. "You were always so good with the children, and we've had trouble finding someone who understands how to make reading feel like play rather than work." Papaji was not pleased when I told him about the job opportunity. "Why do you need to work?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes hard. "I provide everything you and Asha need. What kind of man would I be if I made my dead son's wife go out and work like some common laborer? It's not about the money." I lied, though the financial independence was exactly what I was hoping for. "It's about having something meaningful to do with my time. I was good at my job, and I miss it. You have meaningful work right here," Papaji said firmly. "Taking care of Asha, helping me maintain the household. These are important responsibilities, Beta. A mother's first duty is to her child, not to some job that will take her away from home." The conversation was a familiar pattern, Papaji framing his control as concern for my well-being and Asha's needs. But this time, instead of accepting his logic, I felt a spark of anger that surprised me with its intensity. "Arjun never had a problem with me working," I said quietly. "He was proud of what I did at the library." Papaji's face darkened at the mention of his son. "Arjun is dead," he said bluntly. "I'm the one responsible for this family now, and I think it's better if you stay home where you belong." The word belong hit me like a slap. It was the same word he used during his nighttime visits when he reminded me that I belonged to his family, now that my body belonged to him as payment for his protection. Hearing him use it in normal conversation made me realize how completely he saw me as his property, rather than as a person with my own desires and agency. But I didn't back down this time. "I'm going to take the job," I said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in months. "Mrs. Krishnan is expecting an answer by Friday, and I'm going to tell her yes." For a moment, we stared at each other in silence. Then Papaji smiled, but it was a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Beta," he said smoothly. "If work is so important to you, then naturally you should pursue it. I just hope you won't be too tired in the evenings to fulfill your other responsibilities." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. If I insisted on having a life outside his house, he would make sure I paid for it in private. That night's assault was the worst yet. Papaji was more violent than usual, more deliberately cruel, as if punishing me for my moment of defiance. But even as he hurt me, I held on to the knowledge that I had stood up to him, however briefly. Some part of me was still fighting, still refusing to be completely broken. The job at the library became my salvation and my additional burden simultaneously. 3 mornings a week, I would drop Asha off at a daycare center that Papaji had grudgingly approved then spend 4 hours in the world I had loved before my life fell apart. Working with children reminded me of who I used to be, competent, creative, capable of bringing joy into other people's lives. But the price I paid at home was steep. Papa G punished every sign of independence with increased violence and psychological cruelty. He began making comments about my appearance in front of Asha, telling her that Mama was getting too thin and looking sick because she was working too much. He started questioning me about my interactions with male colleagues, accusing me of being inappropriate with the few men who worked at the library. "People will talk," he warned me repeatedly. "A young widow who spends too much time around men who seems too friendly, too eager to leave her home. They'll say you're not grieving properly for Arjun, that you're looking for a replacement husband before his body is even cold in the ground." The accusations were baseless. I barely spoke to my male colleagues beyond professional necessity, but they were effective psychological warfare. Papaji understood that my reputation was one of the few things I still cared about, protecting both for my own sake and for Asha's future. Despite the increased pressure at home, the job gave me something invaluable: contact with the outside world and access to information. At the library, I had unrestricted access to newspapers, magazines, and books, including materials about domestic violence and legal rights for women. I began educating myself about my options, researching divorce laws, learning about restraining orders and protective custody arrangements. More importantly, I started observing the other women who brought their children to the library. Some of them were clearly struggling. I could see it in their tired eyes, their careful way of speaking, the way they flinched when their phones rang. I began to understand that I wasn't the only woman living with a terrible secret, and that knowledge made me feel less isolated and more determined to find a way out. The breakthrough came in February 1999, 8 months after the abuse began. I was shelving books in the children's section when I overheard 2 women talking quietly near the parenting resources section. "The counselor at the women's center was very helpful," one of them was saying. "She explained that it's not my fault that I don't deserve to be treated that way, and that there are legal options I didn't know about." "But what about the children?" the other woman asked. "How do you protect them when you're trying to leave?" "That's exactly what she helped me figure out. There are procedures, safe ways to do it. You don't have to choose between your safety and your children's well-being." I pretended to be busy with the books, but I was listening to every word. When the women left, I went to the section where they had been browsing and found several books about domestic violence, legal rights, and resources for women in crisis. I checked out 3 of them, hiding them inside larger books about child development that Papa G wouldn't question if he saw them. That night, after Papa G's visit, and after I was sure he was asleep, I read by flashlight until dawn. The books described patterns of abuse that were horrifyingly familiar. The isolation, the manipulation, the alternation between violence and false tenderness, the way abusers made their victims feel responsible for the abuse they suffered. More importantly, the books outlined concrete steps for escape, documenting the abuse, building a support network, understanding legal protections, planning for safety. For the first time since the nightmare began, I saw a path forward that didn't involve simply enduring until something changed on its own. The next day, during my lunch break at the library, I called the Women's Helpline, whose number I had memorized months earlier. "Women's Crisis Helpline. This is Priya speaking. How can I help you?" The voice on the phone was calm and professional, but there was warmth in it that made my throat close up with unexpected emotion. For so long, I had been surrounded by Papa G's manipulation and society's indifference that I had forgotten what genuine concern sounded like. "I need help," I whispered into the phone, glancing around the library to make sure no one could overhear. "My father-in-law he's been—" I couldn't say the words. Even after months of violation, I still couldn't speak the truth aloud. "Take your time," Priya said gently. "I'm here to listen, and nothing you tell me will shock or upset me. I've heard many difficult stories, and my job is to help you figure out what options you have." Something about her matter-of-fact kindness broke through my paralysis. "He's been raping me," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "For 8 months. Since 3 months after my husband died. I live in his house with my baby daughter, and I don't know how to get away from him safely."
I'm so sorry this is happening to you," Priya said, and I could hear that she meant it. "What you're describing is absolutely not your fault, and you don't deserve to be treated this way. Can you tell me a little more about your situation? Are you in immediate physical danger?" Over the next 20 minutes, I told her everything. The story poured out of me like water from a broken dam. Papa G's systematic grooming the night the abuse started, the ongoing assaults, the isolation and manipulation, my fears about what would happen to Asha if I tried to leave. Priya listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about my living situation, Papa G's behavior patterns, and my available resources. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. Mira, what you've described is a very serious situation, and I want you to know that there are people who will believe you and help you. Have you been able to document any of the abuse photographs of injuries, written records of incidents? Anything like that? I've been keeping a notebook, I said, hidden in my daughter's diaper bag. I write down what happens each time disguised as household accounts. That's very smart, Priya said, and I felt a flush of pride at her approval. Documentation like that can be crucial if you decide to pursue legal action. Have you told anyone else about what's happening? No, I admitted. I don't know who would believe me. Papa G is very respected in the community, and I'm just a widow with no family nearby. People would probably think I was mentally unstable or trying to cause trouble. Unfortunately, that kind of victim blaming is common, Priya said. But I want you to know that there are professionals, police officers, lawyers, social workers who are trained to handle these situations and who will take your claims seriously. The question is whether you're ready to take that step. I thought about Asha, about the way she had started flinching when Papa G raised his voice, about how she sometimes cried at night for no apparent reason. I thought about my own deteriorating mental health, the way I had stopped caring about anything beyond basic survival, the constant fear that colored every moment of my existence. I want to leave, I said, but I'm terrified he'll hurt Asha to get back at me, or that he'll convince a court that I'm an unfit mother and take her away from me. Those are valid concerns, Priya acknowledged. But staying in an abusive situation isn't protecting Asha. It's exposing her to trauma that will affect her for the rest of her life. Children absorb more than we think they do, and growing up in a house where violence is normalized can have serious psychological consequences. Her words hit me like a physical blow because I knew she was right. I had been so focused on protecting Asha from immediate harm that I hadn't fully considered the long-term damage of raising her in Papa G's house, where she was learning that women existed to serve men's needs and that violence was an acceptable way to maintain control. What would I need to do? I asked. First, we need to build your case carefully, Priya explained. Continue documenting everything, but also try to gather additional evidence if possible. If Papa G leaves marks on you, photograph them. If he makes threats or admissions, try to record them if you can do so safely. Second, we need to establish a support network for you, people who can provide temporary housing, childcare, emotional support during the legal process. I don't really have people like that, I said, feeling despair creep back in. My mother is elderly and lives far away. I have a few acquaintances from work, but no one I'm close enough to ask for help with something this serious. That's where we come in, Priya said. We have partnerships with shelters, legal aid organizations, and support groups. You won't have to do this alone, but I need to be honest with you about what the process involves. Leaving an abusive situation is often the most dangerous time for victims. Abusers frequently escalate their violence when they feel they're losing control. So we need to plan very carefully to keep you and Asha safe.
The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Priya explaining the resources available to me and the steps involved in building a case against Papaji. She gave me a safe phone number I could call anytime, day or night, and the address of a legal aid clinic that provided free services to women in my situation. "Remember?" she said before we hung up. "What's happening to you is not normal. It's not your fault, and it's not something you have to accept. You deserve to live without fear, and Asha deserves to grow up in a safe environment. It's going to be hard, but it's possible to get out of this situation." After I hung up, I sat in the library bathroom for several minutes, crying with a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because someone had finally heard my story and believed it, terror because I now faced the overwhelming task of actually changing my circumstances. But for the first time in 8 months, I felt something I had almost forgotten: hope. That evening, I began implementing Priya's suggestions with new determination. I moved my hidden notebook to a safer location inside a hollowed-out children's book that I kept on a shelf with dozens of others. I started paying closer attention to Papaji's statements during his assaults, trying to remember exact quotes that might be legally significant. Most importantly, I began the psychological work of preparing myself for escape. I researched bus schedules to other cities, identified the location of the nearest police station, and started building a mental inventory of what Asha and I would need to take with us when we left. But 3 weeks into my planning, Papaji made a discovery that changed everything. I came home from work on a Tuesday afternoon to find him sitting at the kitchen table with my hidden notebook open in front of him. My blood turned to ice as I realized that all my careful documentation, all my evidence, was now in his hands. "Interesting reading?" he said calmly, not looking up from the pages. "Very creative writing, Beta. You always did have quite an imagination." I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the immediate terror of being caught. Asha was playing in the living room, thank goodness, oblivious to the crisis unfolding in the kitchen. "Well, where did you find that?" I finally managed to ask. Papaji smiled and held up the hollow children's book. "You're not as clever as you think you are. I've been watching you carefully since you started acting differently, becoming more confident. It made me suspicious. So I searched your room thoroughly while you were at work, and I found your little hiding place." He stood up and walked toward me, still holding the notebook. I backed against the wall, my heart hammering with fear about what he might do. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice conversational and terrifying. "You're going to stop this foolishness immediately. You're going to quit your job at the library and focus on being a proper mother and daughter-in-law. And if you ever try anything like this again, if you so much as speak to another person about our private family matters, there will be consequences for both you and Asha." "What kind of consequences?" I whispered. Papaji's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "Well, for example, everyone in our community knows that widows sometimes become mentally unstable from grief. They neglect their children, have delusions, make up stories about the family members who are trying to help them. Sometimes such women need to be hospitalized for their own safety, and their children need to be placed in more stable homes until the mothers recover." The threat was crystal clear. He could have me declared mentally incompetent and take custody of Asha, and given his reputation in the community versus my status as a grieving widow, many people would believe his version of events. "You wouldn't," I said, but I could hear the doubt in my own voice. "Try me," Papaji said simply. Then he walked to the stove, turned on a burner, and held my notebook over the flame until it caught fire. I watched months of careful documentation turn to ash, taking my evidence and my escape plan with it. That night's assault was the most brutal yet, as Papaji reasserted his complete control over my body and my circumstances. But even as he hurt me, I clung to something he didn't know about. I had memorized Priya's phone number, and the legal aid clinic she had mentioned was still an option. My notebook was gone, but my memory remained intact. And somewhere in the depths of my despair, I was already planning my next move.
The weeks following Papa G's discovery of my notebook were the darkest period of my entire ordeal. He had stripped away my job, my small measure of independence, and my carefully gathered evidence in one devastating blow. More crushing than the loss of documentation was the psychological impact of having my secret resistance exposed and destroyed. I felt like a prisoner who had been caught planning an escape attempt. Not only was I back where I started, but my captor was now watching me more carefully than ever.
Papa G implemented new restrictions with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully crushed a rebellion. I was no longer allowed to leave the house alone under any circumstances. If I needed to go to the market, he accompanied me and monitored every conversation. If I took Asha to the park, he came along and positioned himself where he could hear everything I said to other parents. He disconnected our phone, claiming it was broken and expensive to repair, cutting off my last direct link to the outside world. "You brought this on yourself," he told me matter-of-factly one morning as I served him breakfast with hands that shook from exhaustion and despair. "If you had accepted your position in this family gracefully, none of these restrictions would be necessary. But you proved that you can't be trusted, so now we have to do things the hard way." The isolation was more complete than it had ever been before. Worse than the physical confinement was the way Papa G had begun to involve Asha in his psychological warfare. He would ask her questions designed to undermine my authority. "Asha Beta, does Mama seem sad all the time? Do you think she's happy living with us? Or does she want to go away and leave you behind?" My 2-year-old daughter, confused by the adult tensions she could sense but not understand, would look between us with worried eyes. Sometimes she would cling to me protectively. Other times she would seek comfort from Papa G when I was too depressed to engage with her properly. I watched her developing a fearful, people-pleasing personality, always trying to gauge the adult's moods and respond appropriately, and I knew that the trauma was spreading to her in ways that would affect her for the rest of her life. But the worst part was how effectively Papa G had convinced me that escape was impossible. Without documentation, without outside support, without financial resources, how could I prove what was happening to me? He was a respected member of the community with a government pension and a reputation for caring for his dead son's family. I was a widow with no independent income and increasingly obvious signs of psychological distress. Who would believe my word against his? The tipping point came in late March, 3 months after Papa G had destroyed my notebook. I had sunk so deeply into depression that I was barely functioning as a mother. I struggled to get out of bed in the mornings, forgot to feed Asha meals at regular times, and sometimes stared at nothing for hours while she played alone on the floor. My physical health was deteriorating too. I had lost significant weight, developed chronic insomnia, and started having panic attacks triggered by seemingly random sounds or smells. One afternoon, while Papa G was napping, and I was supposed to be watching Asha, I found myself standing on the balcony of his second-floor house, looking down at the concrete courtyard below, and thinking about how easy it would be to simply step over the railing. The thought scared me because it felt less like despair and more like practical problem-solving, as if my mind had moved beyond emotional pain to a calm calculation of alternatives. I was still standing there contemplating the drop when Asha toddled onto the balcony behind me. "Mama," she said, tugging on my sari. "Mama, play." I looked down at her, my beautiful, innocent daughter, who needed me to be strong, who was depending on me to protect her from Papa G's influence, who would be completely at his mercy if I gave up, and I felt something shift inside me. Not hope, exactly, but a fierce determination that surprised me with its intensity. I couldn't save myself, but I could still save her. That evening, after Papa G's nightly visit, I lay in the darkness making plans. I couldn't call Priya, the phone was disconnected, but I remembered the address of the legal aid clinic she had mentioned. I couldn't document the abuse with photographs or recordings, but I could document it with my own testimony, and I could describe the destroyed notebook in enough detail to make my story credible. Most importantly, I realized that I had been thinking about this wrong.
I had been trying to gather enough evidence to prove Papa G's guilt in a court of law. But what I really needed was enough credibility to convince authorities to take me seriously long enough to get Asha and me to safety. Once we were away from Papa G's immediate control, I could build a more complete case. The opportunity I needed came 2 weeks later, when Papa G announced that he had to travel to Delhi for a day to handle some bureaucratic matter related to his pension. He would be gone for nearly 8 hours, long enough for me to get to the legal aid clinic and back if I moved quickly. "I'm trusting you to behave yourself while I'm gone," he told me the night before his trip, his hands rough on my body, as he reminded me of my place in his hierarchy. "Don't make me regret that trust, Beta. Remember what will happen if you try to betray this family." But for the first time in months, his threats felt less terrifying and more like evidence of his own fear. He was worried about leaving me unsupervised, which meant he recognized that I still had some agency, some potential for resistance. That recognition gave me strength I hadn't felt since he destroyed my notebook. The next morning, I waited until Papa G's bus had been gone for 30 minutes, then dressed Asha in her best outfit and put together a small bag with her favorite toys and snacks. I told her we were going on an adventure to meet some new friends who would help Mama feel better. The legal aid clinic was across the city, requiring 2 bus transfers and a long walk through unfamiliar neighborhoods. Asha was cranky from the heat and the crowds, and I was terrified that someone would recognize us and report back to Papa G, but we made it to the clinic just before lunch. The building was smaller and more run down than I had expected, but the receptionist was kind and immediately understood that I was in crisis. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting in a small office across from a woman named Rashida, who listened to my story with the same professional compassion I had heard in Priya's voice. "What you're describing is definitely actionable," Rashida told me after I had explained the situation. "The challenge is that domestic violence cases are always difficult to prove, especially when there's a significant power imbalance between the victim and the perpetrator. But the fact that you've been documenting the abuse even though the evidence was destroyed shows that you understand the seriousness of the situation." "What can I do?" I asked. "I can't stay in that house much longer. I'm worried about what the stress is doing to my daughter, and I'm worried about what I might do to myself if things don't change." Rashida leaned forward, her expression serious. "I'm going to be completely honest with you about your options. The ideal situation would be for you to file a police report, immediately get a restraining order, and move to a women's shelter while we build a legal case. But that approach requires you to be prepared for Papa G to retaliate. He might try to have you declared mentally incompetent, or he might escalate his violence before the legal system can protect you." "But what's the alternative?" "The alternative is to plan a more gradual exit. Continue living in his house while we work behind the scenes to build a case, gather evidence, and establish support systems. It's safer in some ways, but it means enduring more abuse while we work." I thought about Asha, about the way she had started flinching when adults raised their voices about how she sometimes cried at night for reasons she couldn't explain. I thought about my own deteriorating mental health, about standing on that balcony and calculating the distance to the ground. "I can't wait," I said. "I need to get out now, whatever the risks." Rashida nodded as if she had expected this answer. "All right, then we need to move quickly and carefully. Are you prepared to file a police report today?" My heart was pounding, but my voice was steady when I answered. "Yes." The police station was a 15-minute walk from the legal aid clinic, an imposing concrete building that smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes. Rashida had called ahead to speak with Inspector Sharma, a woman she knew who had experience handling domestic violence cases, so we didn't have to wait long before being ushered into a small interview room. Inspector Sharma was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s with short hair and a no-nonsense manner that I found reassuring. She introduced herself to both Asha and me, offering my daughter a coloring book and crayons before sitting down to hear my story. "Take your time," she said, opening a notebook and clicking her pen. "I need you to be as specific as possible about dates, times, and exactly what happened. I know this is difficult,
but the more detail you can provide, the stronger case we can build.
For the next hour, I told her everything. The gradual boundary violations during my early widowhood, the night the sexual abuse began, the pattern of assaults that had continued for 9 months. Papa G's threats about taking Asha away from me, the isolation and psychological manipulation, the destruction of my documentation. Inspector Sharma asked clarifying questions without judgment, occasionally pausing to let me compose myself when the memories became overwhelming. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. Mrs. Patel, what you've described constitutes multiple serious crimes: rape, criminal intimidation, unlawful confinement, and others. Based on your testimony, I have grounds to arrest Papa G immediately. But I need you to understand what will happen next.
Tell me,
I said, trying to keep my voice steady, while Asha colored peacefully beside me, oblivious to the gravity of our conversation. Once I issue an arrest warrant, everything becomes public. Papa G will be taken into custody probably tonight when he returns from Delhi. The charges will be filed officially, which means your name and his will be in court records that journalists sometimes review. There will likely be a trial, which means you'll have to testify about what happened to you in front of strangers, including Papa G's defense attorney, who will try to discredit your story. The prospect was terrifying, but not as terrifying as the thought of returning to Papa G's house and pretending nothing had changed. What about Asha? I asked. Will she be safe during all of this?
That's my biggest concern, Inspector Sharma admitted. Papa G will probably try to argue that you're an unfit mother, that you're making up these allegations due to mental instability, and that Asha should be placed in his custody or with other relatives while the case is pending. We need to be prepared for that possibility.
Rashida, who had been taking notes throughout the interview, spoke up.
We have a family court petition prepared that requests emergency custody protection for Asha. It argues that she's also a victim in this situation and needs to be protected from potential retaliation. But Mrs. Patel, you need to understand that there are no guarantees. The legal system doesn't always work the way it should, especially in cases involving respected men accused by young widows.
I looked down at Asha, who was carefully coloring a picture of a house with a bright yellow sun above it. Everything I was about to do was for her to give her a chance to grow up safe, to show her that women didn't have to accept abuse to break the cycle before it damaged her permanently.
I want to file the charges, I said firmly. Whatever happens next, at least I'll have told the truth.
Inspector Sharma nodded and started making phone calls to set the legal machinery in motion. Within an hour, arrest warrants had been issued, social services had been notified about Asha's situation, and arrangements had been made for us to stay at a women's shelter until the immediate crisis was resolved. But as we were preparing to leave the police station, Inspector Sharma's phone rang with news that changed everything. Papa G had not gone to Delhi as he had claimed. Instead, he had been watching the house from a neighbor's window, and he had followed us to the legal aid clinic and then to the police station. He was outside the building right now, along with several relatives and community leaders who had vouched for his character and were demanding to speak with me. Mrs. Patel, Inspector Sharma said after hanging up the phone, this situation has become more complicated. Papa G is claiming that you've had a psychological breakdown due to grief, that you've been acting erratically for months, and that you're making false accusations against the man who has been caring for you out of the goodness of his heart. He's brought witnesses who will testify that you've seemed unstable recently. Through the window, I could see a crowd of about 15 people gathered on the steps of the police station. I recognized several faces, neighbors from Papa G's street, members of the temple committee where he was active. The old man who ran the grocery store where we shopped. They were all looking up at the building with expressions of concern and disapproval, as if I were the criminal being held inside.
What does this mean for the charges? I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. It means the case will be harder to prosecute, Inspector Sharma said honestly. A defense attorney will use this gathering as evidence that Papa G is a respected community member who couldn't possibly be guilty of what you're accusing him of. They'll argue that if he were really a rapist, these people wouldn't be here supporting him.
I felt the familiar despair beginning to settle over me, the sense that Papa G's power and influence
would always protect him from consequences. But then Asha looked up from her coloring and asked, "Mama, why are all those people outside? Are they here to see us?" The innocence in her question reminded me that this wasn't just about whether I could win in court. It was about whether I could live with myself if I gave up without fighting. Even if Papa G's supporters convinced a judge that I was mentally unstable, even if I lost custody of Asha temporarily, I would have told the truth. I would have created a record of what he had done. I would have refused to be silenced by his manipulation and intimidation. "Let's go talk to them," I said, standing up and taking Asha's hand. Inspector Sharma looked surprised. "Are you sure you're not required to speak with anyone? We can escort you out through a back exit." "No," I said, feeling calmer than I had in months. "I'm not hiding anymore. If they want to hear my side of the story, I'll tell them." We walked out the front door of the police station together. Inspector Sharma, Rashida, Asha, and me. The crowd fell silent as we appeared, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, concern, and judgment. Papa G was standing at the center of the group, looking every inch the wronged patriarch. His expression perfectly calibrated to convey hurt confusion rather than anger.
"Ah, Beta," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. "What is this madness? These people are telling me you've made some kind of complaint against me. You know that can't be true. You know how much I love you and Asha, how I've cared for you since my poor son died."
Several people in the crowd nodded sympathetically, and I heard someone mutter, "Grief can do terrible things to a woman's mind." I looked at Papa G, this man who had violated me hundreds of times, who had threatened my child, who had systematically destroyed my sense of self-worth, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year, the complete absence of fear. He couldn't hurt me anymore, because I had already survived the worst he could do, and now everyone would know the truth about who he really was. "You raped me," I said, my voice clear and steady enough to carry to every person in the crowd. "For 9 months, you came to my bedroom at night and raped me. You told me it was payment for housing Asha and me. You threatened to take my daughter away if I told anyone. You destroyed the evidence I was gathering to prove what you were doing to me." The crowd's reaction was immediate, and loud gasps of shock, angry denials, confused murmurs. Papa G's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment, revealing the rage beneath his performance. "She's sick," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Can't you see she's sick? This is what grief has done to her mind. She needs help, not encouragement in these delusions." But Inspector Sharma stepped forward before anyone could respond to his claims. "Mr. Krishnan Patel," she said formally, "you are under arrest for rape, criminal intimidation, and unlawful confinement. You have the right to remain silent and the right to legal representation." As the handcuffs clicked around Papa G's wrists, the crowd erupted in protests and arguments. Some people were shouting that this was impossible, that Papa G was being framed. Others were looking at me with new attention, perhaps remembering small signs they had overlooked, beginning to consider that my accusations might be true. But I wasn't listening to any of them anymore. I was watching Papa G's face as he realized that his reputation, his carefully constructed image, his power over me and my daughter, all of it was crumbling in front of the very people whose respect he had valued most. For the first time since Arjun's death, I felt like myself again. The women's shelter where Asha and I spent the next 3 months was nothing like the safe haven I had imagined during my darkest moments in Papa G's house. It was overcrowded, noisy, and institutional, with thin walls that provided little privacy and shared facilities that required constant negotiation with other residents. But it was also the first place in almost a year where I could sleep without fear, where I could speak freely about my experiences, where Asha could play with other children without absorbing the toxic tension of adult secrets. The legal process moved slowly, as Rashida had warned me it would. Papa G hired an expensive defense attorney who immediately began implementing the strategy Inspector Sharma had predicted, portraying me as a mentally unstable widow who had fabricated abuse allegations against the saintly father-in-law who had cared for her out of pure kindness. They brought character witnesses who testified about Papaji's reputation in the community, his devotion to his dead son's family, his financial support for local charities and religious institutions. The defense attorney, a sharp-dressed man named Mr. Gupta, was particularly effective at making me feel like I was the one on trial. During my testimony, he questioned every detail of my story, suggesting that I had confused dreams with reality, that grief had made me paranoid and delusional, that I was motivated by a desire to gain control of Papaji's property and assets.
Mrs. Patel? He said during cross-examination, his tone suggesting patient concern for a confused child. Isn't it true that you were taking medication for depression after your husband's death? Isn't it possible that these medications combined with your emotional distress could have caused you to misinterpret normal family interactions as something sinister? I had to admit that I had taken sleeping pills occasionally during the worst of my grief, which Mr. Gupta immediately seized upon as evidence that my perception of reality had been compromised. He also made much of the fact that I had destroyed my own documentation, conveniently omitting the fact that Papaji had forced me to watch him burn my notebook. But the prosecution had evidence that Mr. Gupta couldn't explain away. The medical examination I had undergone immediately after filing charges showed signs of sexual trauma consistent with prolonged abuse. More damaging to Papaji's case was the testimony of Dr. Reddy Asha's pediatrician, who testified that she had noted signs of psychological distress in my daughter during routine visits, regression in developmental milestones, sleep disturbances, unusual fearfulness around male authority figures.
Children absorb more than we think they do, Dr. Reddy testified. The symptoms I observed in Asha were consistent with a child living in a household where domestic violence was occurring, even if she wasn't directly witnessing the abuse. The turning point in the trial came when the prosecution called Mrs. Desai an elderly neighbor who had lived next to Papaji for 15 years. I had barely known her during my time in his house. She was a widow herself, who kept to herself and rarely engaged in neighborhood social activities. But she had been paying attention to things other people missed. I heard crying at night. She testified, her voice quiet but clear in the courtroom. From the house next door, from the room where Mira and her baby were staying. Not the crying of a woman in normal grief, but the crying of someone in pain, someone trying to be quiet. It happened regularly, always late at night, always when no one else would be awake to hear it. She also testified that she had seen Papaji buying women's undergarments at the market, items that were clearly too small for any adult woman, that looked like they were meant for someone much younger and smaller than me. When the prosecutor asked what she thought these items were, for Mrs. Desai looked directly at Papaji and said, "I think he was buying replacements for clothing he had damaged." The defense tried to discredit Mrs. Desai's testimony by pointing out that she was elderly and might have confused sounds or misremembered details. But her account was so specific, so consistent with my own testimony, that it clearly made an impression on the judge. Papaji never took the stand in his own defense, which Mr. Gupta explained as a strategic decision to avoid subjecting his client to unnecessary harassment. But I could see the calculation behind the choice. Papaji's arrogance and sense of entitlement were so deeply ingrained that he probably couldn't have maintained a convincing facade of innocence under aggressive questioning. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and the verdict was announced on a Tuesday morning in August 1999, 14 months after the abuse began. I sat in the gallery, holding Asha on my lap, both of us dressed in the bright yellow salwar kameez that had become my favorite outfit during our time at the shelter. Yellow had come to represent hope for me, the color of sunlight and marigolds and new beginnings. In the matter of the state versus Krishnan Patel, the judge announced, "This court finds the defendant guilty on all charges. The defendant is sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for rape, 2 years for criminal intimidation, and 1 year for unlawful confinement sentences to run concurrently." The defendant is also ordered to pay compensation to the victim in the amount of 50,000 rupees. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and I felt a weight I had been carrying for more than a year finally lift from my shoulders. Justice wouldn't undo what Papaji had done to me, wouldn't give me back the months of trauma and terror, wouldn't restore my sense of safety in the world. But it proved that truth could prevail over power, that women's voices could be heard and believed, that even respected men could be held accountable for their crimes. As Papaji was led away in handcuffs, he looked at me with an expression of pure hatred that reminded me why I had been so afraid of him for so long. But fear was no longer my primary emotion when I looked at him. What I felt instead was pity for a man so consumed with his own desires that he had destroyed his family, his reputation, and his freedom to satisfy them. The months following the trial were challenging in different ways than the abuse had been. Asha and I moved to a small apartment in a different part of the city, funded partly by Papaji's court-ordered compensation, and partly by my return to work at a library that specialized in legal research. The job paid better than my previous position and gave me access to resources that helped me understand my rights and options as we rebuilt our lives. But healing wasn't a straight path. I struggled with nightmares, panic attacks, and periods of depression that made simple tasks feel overwhelming. Asha had her own trauma to process confusion about why Nana wasn't part of our lives anymore, behavioral regression that required patience, and professional counseling trust issues that affected her relationships with other adults. The therapy was difficult but transformative. Dr. Mehta, the counselor we worked with, helped me understand that survival wasn't the same as healing, that I needed to actively work to reclaim my sense of agency and self-worth. She also helped Asha develop language for her feelings and fears, giving her tools to process experiences that were too complex for a child to understand without support. "You saved her," Dr. Mehta told me during one of our sessions. "By finding the courage to leave, by speaking the truth even when it was dangerous, you showed Asha that women don't have to accept abuse. That lesson will stay with her for the rest of her life." 7 years passed before I received the letter that would close the final chapter of my story with Papaji. Asha was 9 years old, thriving in school, confident and curious about the world in ways that reminded me daily of how far we had both come. I was 34, working as the head librarian at the legal research facility and cautiously dating a kind, patient man named Rohit who understood that trust was something I had to rebuild slowly. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March 2006, delivered by a clerk from the prison administration office. Papaji had died of a heart attack in his cell 3 days earlier, and per protocol his next of kin were being notified. As his daughter-in-law, I was technically family despite everything that had happened between us. Along with the death notification was a second envelope marked, "To be delivered to Mrs. Meera Patel upon my death," in Papaji's familiar handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it, not sure what final manipulation or attempt at control I might find inside. But what I read was something I had never expected: a confession. "Meera, I am dying, and I find that I cannot meet my Maker without acknowledging the truth of what I did to you. You were right about everything. I raped you, I threatened you, I terrorized you, and I tried to destroy your credibility when you found the courage to speak against me. I have spent 7 years in this prison telling myself that I was wrongfully convicted, that you were a disturbed woman who had fabricated lies about me. But lying to the world is easier than lying to yourself, and I can no longer pretend that I am anything other than what you said. I was a monster who abused the trust of a grieving woman and traumatized an innocent child. I want you to know that my actions had nothing to do with love or family duty or any of the other justifications I gave you during those terrible months. I hurt you because I enjoyed having power over you, because I was arrogant enough to believe that I deserved to take whatever I wanted, because I thought your vulnerability after Arjun's death made you an easy target. I was wrong about everything,
but especially about you. You were never weak, never broken, never the helpless victim I thought I was controlling. You were strong enough to document what I was doing to you, brave enough to seek help, courageous enough to face me in court and tell the truth, even when the entire community was watching. You saved yourself and your daughter, and you showed other women that it's possible to fight back against men like me. I know this confession doesn't undo the harm I caused, and I'm not writing it to seek forgiveness I don't deserve. I'm writing it because you deserve to know that justice was real, that the court was right to believe you, that your courage mattered. I destroyed your evidence because I was terrified that people would see who I really was. You rebuilt that evidence through your own testimony and your own strength, and you made sure that the truth came out, despite my attempts to silence you. I hope you have found peace and happiness in the years since the trial. I hope Asha has grown up knowing how brave her mother is. I hope you both have learned to trust again, to love again, to believe in a world where women's voices matter. You won, Meera. In every way that counts, you won. Krishnan Patel. I read the letter 3 times before setting it down on the kitchen table next to my morning tea. Then I called Dr. Mehta, who had continued to be a resource for me even after our regular sessions ended, and read her Papaji's confession over the phone. How does it feel to hear him acknowledge what you always knew was true? She asked after I finished reading. I thought about her question, carefully examining my emotional response to Papaji's final words. Validating, I said finally, but not necessary. I didn't need his confession to know that I was telling the truth. I've known that for years. That's growth, Dr. Mehta said with warmth in her voice. Early in your healing process, his validation would have felt essential. Now you understand that your truth doesn't depend on anyone else's acknowledgement of it. That evening, I sat down with Asha to talk about Papaji's death and his letter. She was old enough now to understand the basic facts of what had happened to us, and we had always been honest with each other about our family history. Are you sad that he died? She asked after I explained the situation. No, I said truthfully. I'm not sad, but I'm not happy either. His death doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't change how we've built our lives since then. It just means that chapter is completely closed now. Asha nodded thoughtfully. Will you keep the letter? I looked down at Papaji's confession, considering her question. The letter was evidence of something I had always known, validation of a truth I no longer needed, validated an apology from someone whose opinion had stopped mattering to me years ago. No, I said, standing up and walking to the kitchen stove. I think I'll let it go. I held Papaji's final words over the flame until they caught fire, watching his last attempt to control our narrative turn to ash, just as he had burned my notebook 7 years earlier. But this time, the destruction felt like liberation rather than loss. Asha and I spent the rest of the evening in our garden tending the marigolds and jasmine that had become my symbols of survival and renewal. As we worked in the soil together, she told me about her school day, her friends, her plans for the future. She was growing up confident and unafraid, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected, able to trust the world, because she had seen her mother refuse to let that world break her. Later, as I tucked her into bed in our small but safe apartment, Asha looked up at me and said, Mama, I'm proud of you for being so brave when I was little. I wasn't brave for me. I told her, brushing her hair back from her forehead. I was brave for you, because you deserved a mother who would fight for your safety and your future. I know, she said seriously. And now I know how to be brave too, because you showed me. As I turned off her light and closed her bedroom door, I realized that Papaji's confession had given me something unexpected, not validation or closure, but clarity about how completely we had transcended his attempts to define our lives. He had written his letter believing that his acknowledgement of the truth was important to me, not understanding that I had moved far beyond needing anything from him. The woman who had once begged him to stop, who had hidden evidence in diaper bags and coded her pain in grocery lists, who had been terrified that no one would believe her, that woman had grown into someone who no longer needed her abuser's permission to know her own truth. I had survived, yes, but more than that, I had prevailed. I had refused to let Papa G's violence become the defining narrative of my life or my daughter's. I had fought back, spoken out, and created a future where both Asha and I were free to become whoever we chose to be. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to write in the journal I had kept for the past 7 years. Not a record of trauma this time, but a celebration of healing growth and the ordinary miracles of a life rebuilt from ruins. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, and I would meet them with the confidence of a woman who had faced her worst fears and discovered that she was stronger than anything that tried to break her. The jasmine outside my window filled the night air with sweetness, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear a woman singing a lullaby to her child, another mother creating safety and love in a world that wasn't always kind to women like us. But we persisted. We survived. We found ways to bloom in the darkness and teach our children that they too had the right to grow toward the light.